The cold steel of a revolver stopped only inches from the frightened maid's forehead. The hidden vault beneath the mansion had one rule that everyone knew. No servant was ever allowed to enter. Yet there she stood, surrounded by stacks of cash, gold bars, and locked cases worth millions. Smoke curled through the open doorway as alarms echoed above. Every armed guard believed they had caught a desperate thief. But instead of reaching for jewels or money, she slowly lifted a small cloth-wrapped bundle with trembling hands. "I wasn't trying to steal your fortune," she whispered. "I was trying to save the only thing the fire could never replace." The ruthless crime boss stared at the bundle, and for the first time in years, his finger refused to pull the trigger. The mansion was built to withstand raids, betrayals, and wars. Its walls were lined with hidden cameras, reinforced steel, and enough armed guards to make any intruder regret taking a single step inside. Yet on that stormy evening, the greatest threat did not arrive through the front gate. It came with smoke. The first alarm echoed through the estate just after sunset. Servants abandoned their chores, security teams rushed toward the mechanical wing, and every hallway filled with urgent footsteps. Thick grey smoke crept across the marble ceilings, carried by the ventilation system from a fire no one had expected. Among the frightened staff, only one person noticed something everyone else ignored. The smoke wasn't drifting upward. It was moving downward. Her heart skipped a beat. Weeks earlier, while cleaning a storage corridor, she had accidentally overheard two maintenance workers arguing about the emergency sprinkler system beneath the mansion. They had complained that if smoke reached the underground vault, the automatic suppression system would flood every compartment without warning. Most people would have thought that was good news. She didn't. Old photographs, handwritten letters, and paper keepsakes would never survive. Without stopping to think, she ran toward the restricted hallway. Every instinct told her to turn back. Every warning sign reminded her that crossing the steel security door meant instant dismissal, or something far worse. But the smell of burning wood grew stronger. She entered the hidden elevator. When the heavy vault door slid open, glittering mountains of gold reflected the flashing emergency lights. Locked cases filled with cash stood untouched. Shelves of priceless jewelry sparkled through the haze. She never looked at any of them. Instead, her eyes landed on a small wooden box, sitting alone on an old shelf, almost forgotten among unimaginable wealth. Dust covered its surface. Across the lid, faded handwriting read only 4 words: "For my son." She wrapped the box inside a cleaning cloth, just as the warning siren inside the vault began to scream. Then came the sound that froze the air. A gun being cocked. She turned slowly. The ruthless owner of the mansion stood in the entrance, surrounded by armed bodyguards. His expression revealed nothing, but the barrel of his revolver pointed directly between her eyes. No one spoke. No one breathed. Every guard expected the order to fire. Instead, the frightened maid carefully held out the cloth-wrapped box with both hands. "I know what this looks like," she whispered, struggling to steady her voice. "But if I had wanted your fortune," she glanced at the untouched gold surrounding her, "I wouldn't have chosen this." The crime boss narrowed his eyes. For the first time, his finger hesitated on the trigger, as he silently wondered why a servant would risk her life for a dusty wooden box, instead of millions in treasure. The silence inside the underground vault lasted only a few seconds before the head of security stepped forward and ripped the wooden box from the maid's trembling hands. "She broke into the vault," he said coldly. "That alone deserves punishment." 2 guards grabbed her arms before she could explain another word. She didn't resist. There was no point. Everyone in the mansion knew what happened to people who entered forbidden places without permission. Some disappeared quietly. Others never returned after being questioned. None were ever given the chance to defend themselves. The ruthless crime boss remained motionless. His eyes never left the dusty wooden box, now resting in the security chief's hands. Smoke continued drifting through the open vault door. Somewhere above them, emergency crews shouted orders, while alarms echoed through the estate. "The fire is spreading through the ventilation system," another guard reported. "We've almost contained it." The crime boss nodded once. "Seal the vault." Steel doors began sliding shut. Only then did the maid finally speak. "If you close it now," she said softly, "the sprinklers will activate." The head of security laughed. "That's exactly what they're supposed to do." She slowly shook her head. "Not for what's inside that box." Several guards exchanged puzzled looks. The security chief frowned. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes never left the old wooden container. "The sprinkler system protects money." She swallowed. "It destroys paper." The words hung in the air. For the first time, the crime boss looked away from her face and toward the forgotten box. She continued carefully. "I clean the maintenance corridors every Thursday. 2 technicians were arguing a few weeks ago. They said the suppression system releases a chemical mist before flooding the room. It protects metal. It protects jewelry. But old photographs," she lowered her eyes, "they don't survive." The head of security scoffed. "So now you're spying on maintenance workers?" "I wasn't spying. I was mopping the floor. No one noticed I was there." The crime boss remained silent. He remembered those maintenance reports. He had signed them himself without reading the details. His fortune had always been the priority. No one had ever mentioned family keepsakes. No one had ever asked. One guard carefully opened the cloth surrounding the wooden box. Its corners were blackened with age. The faded handwriting across the lid was almost impossible to read beneath decades of dust. The crime boss reached for it himself. His fingers stopped halfway. "When was the last time this box was moved?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The estate manager looked uncomfortable. "I don't know." The oldest servant in the room hesitated before speaking. "I remember seeing it when your father was still alive. That was over 20 years ago." The vault suddenly felt different, not like a fortress protecting wealth, more like a forgotten tomb. The maid took a careful breath. "When I entered, I saw gold. I saw diamonds. I saw watches, but none of them were in danger." She looked directly at the crime boss. The smoke was already collecting near the ceiling. I knew the suppression system would activate. I only had time to carry one thing. The security chief folded his arms. "And somehow, you chose the oldest box in the room." She nodded. It was the only object covered in dust. Everything valuable had been cleaned. That box hadn't been touched in years. I thought. Her voice cracked. If something had been forgotten for that long, it might be the one thing no one could ever replace. The room fell silent again. No one mocked her this time. The explanation was too simple, too honest. The crime boss slowly took the wooden box into his own hands. It felt surprisingly light, almost weightless, certainly not heavy enough to contain gold, or jewels, or cash. His thumb brushed across the faded words carved into the lid. "For my son." His breathing slowed. He had walked past this box hundreds of times, yet he had never truly seen it. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not fear. Not anger. Something older. Something he had buried long before he inherited the empire surrounding him. He looked back at the maid. "You risked your life. For something you didn't even know." She gave a small, tired smile. I knew exactly what it was. Everyone stared at her. She gently shook her head. Not what was inside. She looked at the words carved into the lid. I knew it was someone's memory. And memories burn faster than money. The crime boss tightened his grip around the box. For the first time in decades, he found himself wondering what his own father had hidden away. Not from enemies, but from his own son. The wooden box rested on the massive oak table inside the private study. Outside, The fire had finally been extinguished, the alarms had fallen silent, and the mansion was slowly returning to order. Yet inside the room, no one dared to speak. The ruthless crime boss stared at the faded handwriting across the lid. "For my son." The words felt strangely unfamiliar. He could remember countless business meetings held by his father. He remembered strict rules, endless lessons, harsh discipline, but he couldn't remember ever receiving a gift. Not even one. The head of security stepped forward. It could be dangerous. The crime boss barely looked up. My father never hid explosives in family keepsakes. He unlatched the rusted brass lock. It gave way with almost no resistance. The hinges creaked softly, releasing the scent of old cedar wood and yellowed paper that had been trapped inside for decades. Everyone leaned closer. There were no diamonds. No stacks of cash. No secret account numbers. Only a collection of ordinary things. A small toy car with chipped blue paint. Several faded family photographs, tied together with a ribbon. A tiny knitted scarf, barely large enough for a child. A dried white flower, pressed between two sheets of paper. And a bundle of handwritten letters. The room fell completely silent. The maid looked down. Even she had expected something more valuable. Instead, she found herself looking at the quiet remains of someone's childhood. The crime boss picked up the toy car first. One wheel was missing. The paint had almost disappeared. Yet the moment his fingers touched it, a forgotten memory returned. A rainy afternoon, a wooden floor, small hands pushing the little car toward a smiling woman sitting beside the fireplace. He froze. He had not thought about that memory in over 20 years. The image vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. His breathing became uneven. He carefully set the toy back into the box. Next came the photographs. The ribbon had become brittle with age. He untied it carefully. The first picture showed a young couple standing in front of the mansion before it had been expanded into a fortress. There were no armed guards, no bulletproof windows. Only flowers surrounding the entrance. The woman in the photograph smiled with a warmth he barely recognized. She wasn't wearing expensive jewelry. She wasn't posing for anyone. She simply looked happy. He turned over the next photograph. A little boy sat on his mother's shoulders while she laughed at something outside the frame. His heart tightened. He stared at the child for several long seconds before quietly whispering, "I don't remember this." The elderly housekeeper standing near the door wiped away a tear. "I do." Everyone turned toward her. She hesitated before speaking. "Your mother used to take you into the gardens every Sunday. You always wanted to stay outside, but after she passed away." She lowered her eyes. Everything changed. The crime boss remained silent. He remembered the funeral. He remembered black suits. Business associates, bodyguards, lawyers. He remembered being told that tears were a weakness. What he didn't remember was ever looking at another family photograph again. His father had locked every memory away, not destroyed them, not thrown them away, simply hidden them, as if love itself had become too painful to keep in sight. The crime boss reached for the stack of letters. Each envelope carried the same handwriting. None had ever been opened. His hands trembled slightly. The first letter was addressed simply, "To my son." The ink had faded, but every word remained clear. He unfolded the paper. "My sweet boy, if you're reading this, it means time has taken me where I can no longer watch you grow. I know the world around this family is built on power, fear, and loyalty, but I hope none of those things ever convince you that kindness is weakness. Your father will teach you how to protect this family. I wanted to teach you how to protect your heart. If one day you become stronger than everyone around you, promise me you will also become gentler than they expect. That will be your greatest strength." The room remained perfectly still. The crime boss stopped reading. He couldn't continue. His vision blurred. He closed his eyes, but the tears came anyway. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears rolling down the face of a man who had spent most of his life believing he had forgotten how to cry. No one moved. No guard dared look directly at him. The maid quietly lowered her gaze, pretending not to notice. She understood that some moments deserved privacy, even inside a room full of witnesses. After several minutes, the crime boss finally spoke. "My father!" His voice broke. "Never gave me these." The elderly housekeeper nodded slowly. "He couldn't." Everyone looked toward her again. "After your mother passed away, he locked himself inside that vault. He told me he would give you the box when you were old enough." She smiled sadly. "But grief has a way of making people postpone love." He kept saying, "Tomorrow." Her smile disappeared. Tomorrow never came. The crime boss gently placed the letter back inside the box. For years, he had believed the vault contained only the fortune that built his empire. Now he understood its greatest treasure had never been measured in gold. He slowly looked toward the maid. "You saved more than a box tonight." She shook her head. "I only carried it upstairs." He gave a faint smile. "No." His eyes rested on the photographs. "You carried back a part of my family I didn't even know I had lost." For the first time since inheriting the empire, the ruthless ruler of the mansion no longer looked like the most feared man in the city. He looked like a little boy who had finally found his way home. By the following morning, the fire had become little more than a story whispered among the mansion staff. But inside the grand conference hall, another storm was waiting. Every senior member of the organization had been summoned. Long polished tables stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, while armed guards stood silently along the walls. No one spoke above a whisper. Everyone knew that a servant had entered the forbidden vault. There was only one question left. How severe would the punishment be? The plus-size maid stood alone near the entrance, her hands folded quietly in front of her. She had not slept all night. She knew she had broken the most sacred rule in the mansion. Whatever happened next, she had already accepted it. The head of security rose first. His voice echoed across the room. This servant violated the highest level of security. He slowly walked toward her. Whether she stole anything or not is irrelevant. He looked around the room. If we forgive this, every rule inside this house loses its meaning. Several executives nodded. One elderly advisor added calmly, "Compassion cannot replace discipline." Another spoke without hesitation. "Dismiss her immediately. No references. No compensation. Make an example of her." The maid lowered her head. None of their words surprised her. She had expected far worse. The room grew quiet again as the heavy wooden doors opened. Every person immediately stood. The ruthless crime boss entered without saying a word. His expression was impossible to read. In one hand, he carried the old wooden box. In the other, the bundle of faded photographs. He walked slowly toward the head of the table before placing both items in full view of everyone. No one understood why. The head of security cleared his throat. "We've already discussed the punishment." The crime boss finally looked up. "Have you?" His voice remained calm. "So you've reached a verdict." Without asking the only witness who knows the truth. Silence filled the hall. He rested one hand on the wooden box. "Yesterday, every one of you believed this woman entered my vault to steal from me." His eyes moved slowly across the room. "So tell me, what exactly did she steal?" No one answered. The security chief finally replied, "She removed property from the vault." The crime boss nodded slightly. "Then let's see this priceless property." He opened the lid. Instead of gold, he lifted the small blue toy car. Several people frowned. Then came the knitted child's scarf, a dried flower, family photographs. Finally, A worn, handwritten letter. No one spoke. The crime boss held the first photograph high enough for everyone to see. "This," he paused, "is my mother." Another photograph. "This is my father." Then one more. "And this frightened little boy." He looked down quietly. "Was me." The room remained frozen. Some executives lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Others suddenly understood why the old box mattered. The crime boss carefully placed every item back onto the table. "My vault contains enough wealth to buy buildings, companies, perhaps even entire cities." He looked toward the maid. "But while all of you were protecting my fortune, she was protecting something none of you even remembered existed." The words landed harder than any shout. The head of security tried one final argument. "Rules still matter." "They do." The crime boss agreed immediately. "Which is why I intend to enforce one today." Everyone waited. He turned toward the guards. "If another fire had reached that vault, how many of you would have saved these memories?" No one answered. Not one hand moved. Not one voice spoke. Because everyone knew the truth. They would have saved the gold, the diamonds, the cash. No one would have reached for an old wooden box. The crime boss gave a slow nod. "Exactly." He faced the maid. "You entered the vault without permission. That is true. You broke my rules. That is also true." She quietly whispered, "I'm sorry." He looked at her for several seconds before asking, "If you had another chance, would you do the same thing again?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." The entire room stared at her. She continued softly, "Because if I had walked away, you would have lost your last chance to hear your mother's voice." A deep silence followed. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the crime boss walked around the table until he stood directly in front of her. For a brief moment, every guard expected him to dismiss her. Instead, he bowed his head, only slightly, but enough to leave the entire room speechless. "Yesterday," he said quietly, "you risked your life to protect the only part of my family that money could never replace." He looked around at every executive. "From this day forward, any disrespect shown toward her will be treated as disrespect toward me." The announcement sent a wave of disbelief through the room. The head of security lowered his eyes. The advisors remained silent. No one challenged the decision. Not because they suddenly agreed, but because, for the first time, they had seen something they never thought possible. The man feared by everyone had publicly honored a servant, and in doing so, he reminded every person in the room that loyalty measured only in money would never equal the value of a single act of genuine compassion. That evening, the mansion felt different. The smell of smoke had disappeared. The broken windows had been replaced. The damaged walls were already under repair. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had happened. But deep beneath the estate, inside the restored underground vault, two people stood quietly among shelves of untouched gold and priceless treasures. Neither of them had come for the money. The old wooden box rested on a small table beneath a warm reading lamp. The faded photographs had been placed inside protective sleeves. Each letter now rested carefully in archival folders. For the first time in decades, they were no longer hidden away in darkness. The maid carefully adjusted one of the photographs before stepping back. "It looks better here," she said softly. The ruthless crime boss nodded. "It does." For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. His eyes lingered on a photograph of his mother, smiling while holding a little boy in her arms. He had looked at it dozens of times since the fire. Each time, he noticed something new. The warmth in her eyes, the way she held him, the happiness he had forgotten ever existed. Finally, he broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" She smiled politely. Of course. He looked at the shelves overflowing with wealth. When you entered this vault, why didn't you take the diamonds? She looked around the room before letting out a quiet laugh. There were too many. He smiled for the first time. A practical answer. She shook her head. No. Her expression became thoughtful. I've cleaned houses most of my life. I've seen people spend their entire lives chasing expensive things. She looked toward the family photographs. But I've also watched people cry over things money could never bring back. She gently picked up one of the photographs. This smile. She looked at his mother's face. No jeweler can make another one. She carefully returned the photograph to its place. Diamonds can always be replaced. She met his eyes. A mother's smile can't. He lowered his head. Those words settled deep inside him. For years, he had believed his greatest responsibility was protecting everything inside the vault. Now he realized he had misunderstood what truly belonged there. Gold had never been the greatest treasure beneath the mansion. Love was. Memory was. Family was. He reached into his pocket. The maid watched curiously as he placed a heavy brass key on the table between them. It was old, worn smooth by years of use. She immediately recognized it. The master key to the underground vault. Her eyes widened. I can't accept that. You can. No. She gently pushed it back. It belongs to you. He smiled faintly. I used to think so. He looked around the room one last time. My guards protected my money. My advisors protected my business. My security protected these walls. Then he looked directly at her. But you, he paused, protected the memories that made all of those things worth having. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever thanked her like that. No one had ever looked at her with such quiet respect. He gently closed her hand around the key. I'm not giving this to you because I trust you with my fortune. His voice softened. I'm giving it to you because you've already proven you know the difference between wealth and what is truly priceless. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. Not because of the key, but because someone had finally seen the value of the kindness she had carried quietly for so many years. Weeks passed. The mansion slowly changed. The old family photographs were no longer hidden underground. They appeared in the library, the hallway, the study, the grand staircase. Servants often noticed the crime boss pausing for a moment before one of the framed pictures. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he simply stood there in silence. The fear inside the mansion gradually gave way to something unfamiliar. Warmth. The staff no longer whispered only about rules. They also spoke about respect, about gratitude, about the maid who had walked past unimaginable riches to save a forgotten box. One afternoon, the elderly housekeeper found the maid standing in the garden. You changed this family, she said. The maid shook her head. No. She smiled toward the mansion. I think they were simply waiting to remember who they used to be. High above them, sunlight poured through the windows of the restored home. Deep below, inside the vault, the gold remained exactly where it had always been. But the greatest treasure no longer rested behind reinforced steel. It lived openly in the hearts of the people, who finally understood that fortunes can be counted, fortunes can be guarded, and fortunes can be rebuilt. Memories cannot, and sometimes the bravest person in the room is not the one holding the gun, but the one willing to risk everything to save a single forgotten piece of someone's heart.